Thưa quý vị, câu hỏi lớn mà nhiều doanh nghiệp sẽ gặp phải chính là vậy thì doanh nghiệp phải bắt đầu từ đâu? Và là những cái nhà lãnh đạo doanh nghiệp thì chắc chắn là các anh chị đồng ý với chúng tôi rằng là việc hoạch định chiến lược đứng đầu là chìa khóa để mà doanh nghiệp thành công ở mọi thị trường. Bây giờ thì chúng ta hãy cùng đến với phần chia sẻ về chiến lược đi vào thị trường Úc cho doanh nghiệp xây dựng và vật liệu xây dựng từ ngài Church, nguyên Bộ trưởng Bộ Phát triển Cơ sở Hạ tầng Úc, cố vấn cấp cao tập đoàn Navigate Australia. Alan sẽ cung cấp những hiểu biết sâu sắc và chiến lược có giá trị cho các doanh nghiệp Việt Nam muốn khẳng định mình tại thị trường này. Quý vị hãy lưu ý rằng là ở cuối chương trình thì chúng tôi sẽ có một phần Q&A với các diễn giả. Vì vậy nếu mà quý vị lại tiếp tục có những câu hỏi cho ngài Alan đây thì quý vị có thể trực tiếp comment và chúng tôi sẽ thu thập các câu hỏi của quý vị cho phần Q&A. Ngoài ra thì để có thể hiểu được trọn vẹn hơn những chia sẻ từ ngài Church thì quý vị có thể chọn các nút bấm chuyển ngữ ở thanh công cụ của Zoom để lắng nghe phần phiên dịch. Bây giờ thì xin trân trọng kính mời ngài sẽ bắt đầu phần trình bày của mình.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I want to discuss in the short time I have the go-to-market strategies for your businesses should you want to enter the Australian market, to enter Australia overall, or even from Vietnam enter the market. My name's Alan Tudge. As was indicated, I used to be the Federal Infrastructure Minister, and in that regard was responsible for the Australian government expenditure on the major roads, major railways, airports, recreational facilities and the like, which obviously gave me a good overview of the entire infrastructure industry. And now I work in part with Navigate Australia and helping Vietnamese companies and other companies access the Australian market, amongst other things. Now, I want to cover two issues though. First up, let me just quickly cover the overall market and the segments and the growth opportunities. Then I want to cover into a bit of detail the issues that you should be thinking about should you want to enter the Australian market. So here's this first slide with the overview of the markets. And the way you can think about it is in three different segments: residential construction, non-residential construction, and civil construction. What John Davies was talking about was largely the last one in terms of civil construction, and which consists of the transport, the utilities, the big resource projects and the like. And as he indicated, is largely dominated by big giant companies, which he represents. And it is the biggest part of the overall construction market in Australia, representing in the vicinity of about 103 billion Australian dollars last financial year, which is about 65 to 70 billion American dollars. But the other two big segments, which combined are actually bigger than the civil construction, is the residential construction, upon which many of you are involved with. And that's been a very strong part of the economy here in Australia for a very long time, with about 200,000 homes built each year. There are some players, some bigger players there, which are accessible, but there's also just thousands of smaller ones, indeed tens of thousands of smaller players, sometimes mum and dads, who would play in this market. So it can be a tricky market to access if you're not going after those very big companies. And then you have the non-residential construction as well, which of course is your retail and commercial hubs. It can be some of your social and cultural buildings, which might be funded by the government, like a new arts centre or the like, and your industrial hubs. And they're more the medium-sized players that operate there, also a very large part of the market. Just jump to the next one. When you think about what are the prospects going forward, obviously, if you want to get involved in a market, you want to get involved in a growth market if possible. That's where there's going to be more opportunities. The fundamentals in Australia are still very strong for the construction industry. There's some issues for sure, but fundamentally they're strong. And I think particularly for the residential construction market. I've just listed 4 indicators here, and these 4 indicators really are the biggest drivers of construction overall, or 4 of the very big drivers in any case. Your GDP growth, obviously, when you're growing more strongly, you're going to be spending more money on construction. Next year, we're forecast to grow at 2.25% of real growth. Largely, it's forecast to continue that way. So still very steady growth there. Interest rates, a massive driver of the residential and non-residential construction. The cash rate has been steady for some time now at 4.35. That's an historically low rate. There's some debate from economists as to whether or not that might go up slightly, but in the medium term, most expect that to come down, which then becomes an incentive for further growth. Immigration to Australia, a massive driver of housing construction. And we're at record high levels into Australia at the moment. Of over 500,000 net individuals have come into the country last year. It will come down, but it will stay at record high levels for some time. That is a big driver of residential housing construction in particular. And finally, government infrastructure expenditure, again at record highs, like super high. And it's likely to come down over the next few years, but it will stay at very high rates. So in total, that's a pretty good picture to say it's still going to be a very strong market in the years ahead. What does that translate to in terms of projections? I mean, here's some economic forecast or some projections on each of those subsegments, which the Master Builders Association put together, but largely are built on some of those inputs we were talking about in the previous slide. And so you've got overall, and these are in millions of Australian dollars, you can see at the top, the total building and construction activity is still forecast to grow, but grow at more modest rates overall. Where you see the growth, particularly, which is forecast in the years ahead, as I said, is in residential building activity. So we've actually had a couple of down years, despite high immigration in that residential building activity. And that's largely because of some of the factors which John was talking about in terms of supply side factors, actually, as well as some government approval factors, which meant that the housing has not been keeping up with the demand. And it's actually a significant issue in Australia now. And so the forecast now, as you can see, for residential building is for very strong growth in the next 2 or 3 years, 2%, 8.8%, 15% growth, which presents opportunities. The non-residential business activity, it's been strong, forecast to sort of flatline after a couple of years. And in the civil and engineering construction work, it has been phenomenally strong in Australia, driven in part by the boom of investment from governments in big rail and transport projects, but also in our massive resources sector, energy and resources sector in Australia, which John alluded to. That's forecast from the master builders, at least. John might have a different view, to come down a bit over the next few years, but still at very, very high levels. Again, what does that picture present? From your perspective, it presents opportunities. It presents opportunities that there's still very high expenditure rates. This represents over 10% of the Australian economy, and it's likely to continue, and it seems to be particularly exciting in residential building activity. All right, let's jump into go-to-market. What are some of the things that if you want to enter the Australian market, you need to be thinking about? And I want to go through 10 issues in particular. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one, obviously, given the time, but we'll touch on each. And if there's questions subsequently, we can delve into it in a little bit more. So first up, is your product competitive in terms of price and quality? You will know that yourself. You need to do that work and that analysis, because if you're not price competitive and you're not meeting those quality standards, then no matter how good you are in terms of your marketing, it's going to be tough. But Vietnam, from Australia's perspective, is known as being price competitive. And I think increasingly Vietnam is getting a reputation for having very good quality as well. So I think that do that analysis and you will be very well positioned. Doesn't meet Australian standards. Now, what I mean by that is sometimes there'll be an official, almost regulatory standard that you have to meet. And that's a yes-no thing. You have to meet that standard if there is one. And that can be above and beyond just the general quality. You have to meet the standard. Which segments are you going after? This is important in terms of, are you going after the civil and construction? Are you going after civil? Are you going after that non-residential, or are you going after the residential segments of the construction market? Now, that will then lead to a whole bunch of different players, and working out to navigate all the various players is very different in each one of those segments. And in the big players, which our first speaker, John Davies, represents, there's all sorts of subcontractors which sit underneath them, and subcontractors which sit underneath those, which you need to think about depending on the segment you're going after, and indeed which state you might be going after as well. We have 3 very big states. You'll know Melbourne and Sydney, which are in the states of Victoria and New South Wales. Queensland's also sizable. Most of the activity, about 80% of the activity, is in those 3 areas, and the rest of the country represents the other 20%. So needing to think about that, but maybe there's opportunities in those smaller states. From the supplier's perspective, who are the major suppliers presently? You may already know them, but how are they actually supplying that? Are they supplying that from overseas? Do they have a presence in Australia? What's their price point? How long are their contracts? Are you locked out as certain customers because those suppliers already have 3, 4, or 5-year agreements in place? That's important to understand. On the other side, who are the major customers of your product? Again, it's sort of a statement of the obvious, but it's not always obvious to know exactly who the customer is, because your main headline contractor who has the contract to deliver a project, of course, may not be your ultimate customer for the product which you have, because it may be a subcontractor, which is your ultimate customer. Number 6 there, do they purchase directly or through distributors? I was speaking to one of the big companies, McDonald Dow, the other day, and they were saying that any product which is a big Australian company, any product which they acquire from Asia tends to be acquired via their Chinese agent and their Chinese distributor, who's based in Beijing, travels around the region. If you're not connected to that person, it's pretty tough to access McDonald Dow. So you need to find out who the right players are, who the right distributors are. Do you need to have an Australian presence? This is a big question. Some players access the Australian market without having an Australian presence, but sometimes it significantly helps. I would say there's some occasions when it's advantageous to be an Australian-made producer or an Australian domiciled player, because there may be some rules in place which favour Australian companies. But equally, it might just be the case that you need a marketing presence in Australia. And by having a small presence there, it can help you in terms of accessing the players, getting to know other people, the industry associations and the like. So you're much more connected in to the market here. So generally, I would advise, yes, you should have an Australian presence, even if it's a small one, and even if it's just from a marketing and a relationship perspective. How do you market? There's a few ideas there. It's industry associations, trade shows, direct relationships, etc. All the ways typically that you would go about it in Vietnam apply in Australia. Yes, it is competitive, but it's still so much based on relationships, and getting to know more players while you're here certainly helps. Last couple of 2. Are there industry specialists with networks to connect that aligns with your organisation's growth strategies? That's where we can help you as well, in terms of those industry specialists that know a lot of players, can connect you to those industry associations, the trade shows, the direct relationships, etc. And finally, and Shanice is going to speak next about this, how does your immigration strategy align? This is something that often people don't think about, but if you're setting up in Australia and you want to be a manufacturer here to deliver products or even import, and you may need to have additional people here from your business, how do you ensure that you can get those people here? Because it's not straightforward. You need to have that migration strategy in place. And Shanice, as the next speaker, is going to cover off on that. Final page for the last 30 seconds. We can assist. So Navigate Australia can assist